on time. This is the plenary session on geopolitics, which is sort of a requirement for meetings for, maybe the last 40 years or so. It's obviously a subject that gets lots of attention in the press. It gets a lot of attention in oil companies, a lot of attention in various academic institutions and financial companies, etc. And we have a panel that is meant to try to represent part of that universe. And we were going to have a banker, but I have now become the banker, which I did do for 15 years. So I'll try to comment on some of the sort of important questions and methodologies and various other aspects of geopolitics as it affects the financial community. The other two speakers, one is from the World Bank, but was also on Wall Street, and the other is for various multinational institutions. So we want this to be a very participatory meeting. I'm sure more people will come in. I've done a lot of 8:30 sessions, and this is about average, and the room could be quite full by the end of it. We're hoping that we can get lots of questions, and Dave Williams Sr. is in the back with a microphone, and if you have a question when the time comes, if you could identify yourself and your affiliation, and then ask a question, or in fact make a comment if you want, as long as you keep it a reasonable size. With that, I want to introduce Frank Linden from the World Bank, who's going to give us a broader view of this whole idea of what geopolitical risk, or risk in general, is all about from his experience. Frank?
Thank you. My name is Frank Linden. I work currently for MIGA, which stands for Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. It's one of the smallest parts of the World Bank. I've been there for almost 6 years. Before that, I managed country risk and sovereign risk for Merrill Lynch for 11 years. All right. Should I do this again? Okay. Currently at MIGA, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, smallest part of the World Bank Group, in DC for almost 6 years. Before that, managed country risk and sovereign risk for Merrill Lynch in New York for 11 years. Before that, I have a similar background as my neighbor to my right in the intelligence agency of the Netherlands. When I was invited for this panel, I had some hesitation because it's been a while since I was asked to talk on the topic of geopolitics. And to be honest, it's such a broad topic that I had some difficulty understanding how it would link with what I'm currently doing. So instead of trying to come up with a definition of it, I will tell you a little bit how we currently look at the organization where I work at some of the topics that you might be interested in as well. And then also briefly touch upon how in the financial community on Wall Street, similar topics are normally dealt with from my experience there. To start with the latter, when you mention geopolitics or country risk on Wall Street, it's financial risk. The risk that you're gonna not meet your targets or make considerable losses as a result of a financial event which might be triggered by a political or a security event, etc. So there, the terminology is often not geopolitics, but it's country risk. And they make it separate from sovereign risk. Sovereign risk is the plain risk that a government or a municipality who owes you money is not going to pay you, either because they don't have it or they don't want to for various reasons. That is something that is also in the global financial crisis and in the European crisis following thereafter. A lot of attention was given to the rating agencies who pretend or who state that they can give you an assessment of how sovereign risk should be measured. It's these these country ratings, sovereign ratings that you often see. It's very similar, but I, to be honest, had a hard time at Merrill, and my colleagues at other houses around the street had a hard time convincing our management that you can, as a diversified financial institution, you can lose money very different ways than just because a government is not going to pay you. So that we then put under the rubric country risk, which is basically, in today's world, countries still play a very important role, and they organize themselves along country borders. And that organization extends to their legal system, their banking system, their currency, any of which can trigger a crisis, and you can lose money that way. So we try to convey the message that you've got to look beyond sovereign risk, and you look at an economic system, a legal system, a banking system, a currency system, an interest rate system, and when that system gets shocked, you can lose money. Even when you're not owed money by the government, but you're owed money by the banks or the corporates, and etc. Then the global financial crisis hit, a lot of movement on Wall Street, and that was a time for me to reconsider my career to that point, and I thought, you know what, we're going to do something entirely different. We're going to move to a development institution where we're going to do more or less what I was doing on Wall Street, but then in a very different application. So ultimately our idea at MEGA, and to give you a sense, the World Bank Group is about 15,000 people, 10,000 work in, to confuse you, what is called the World Bank, or IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. About 4,000 work in the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which basically invests and lends to the private sector in emerging markets or developing countries. And then there's MEGA, with about 100 people. Very specialized, with the mandate set up in 1988 to stimulate foreign direct investment into emerging markets and developing countries by extending what is called political risk insurance. So if you, as an investor, oil and gas company, developer of power plants, widget maker, whatever it is, you're looking to set up an operation or invest in a brownfield operation in an emerging market, but you are worried because of, let's put it generically for the moment, government interference with your business, you can come to us, and we hope we have a tailored solution for you along 5 different dimensions. So here we define political risk, maybe you want to call it country risk, I don't know if you want to call it geopolitics, in 5 different ways how this government can, pardon my French, mess with your business. The first one is what we call transfer restriction and convertibility, capital controls. We've seen this in the past, time and again. When a country goes into a macroeconomic crisis, they want to hoard hard currency because they have hard currency liabilities that they need to satisfy, and they see hard currency leaving the country, so they put capital controls in place. They either won't allow you to convert local currency that you make out of your business into hard currency. They close the window at the central bank where you come with your local currency and say, can I have hard currency, please? Or they won't allow hard currency to exit the country. They won't permit you to transfer the hard currency out of the country. That's one. Second one is plain old expropriation. A government takes your business. In the name of the people, in the name of whatever, they take your business, and importantly, they don't compensate you for it. Or not enough. Or they do it in a creeping way through all kinds of regulations, administrative means. They make your business unviable, they make your life miserable, so hoping that in the end you will pack up and leave. And they can take over. A third one is what we call breach of contract. What we often see in the power business is you have a direct relationship with the government or a government entity. For instance, on the power purchase agreement, a contract is signed and sealed as you begin, and then along the way somewhere the government changes its mind. And they first approach you nicely and say, can we talk about this tariff that we said we were going to pay you? And then the answer is no, not really, or we have something else in mind. And then at some point the government moves and says, well, forget about it, we're going to pay you half, sorry. Or not even sorry. See you in court. That is something you can insure yourself against. We can talk about the modalities and et cetera, but this is an introductory thing, so I got to move on faster. So we had 3 of them. The fourth one often speaks to people's imagination, which is war and civil disturbance. Asset damage, sorry, as a direct result of acts of war or civil disturbance. Now, that is a tough one for us as an insurance company. To give you a few numbers, MIGA since inception in 1988 has done about 900 deals. We do about 30 to 40 deals a year. Last year we did close to $3 billion. So the average size is about 100 million. In those 900 deals, all in developing countries, right? And the insured party has to be a private party. We cannot insure government entities, public parties. We have to have a private party going into a developing country. In those 900 deals over the course of the last 27 years, we had trouble of one kind or another in about 100 of them. We actually had claims in 16 of them. And of those claims, we paid out 9. So the power, and of those 9 claims, sorry, that is how I came to it. Of those 9 claims, 7 of the 8 that we paid out were for war and civil disturbance. Why? Because the whole business model of my organization is that we leverage the relationship of these countries with the World Bank. Because those much bigger parts, IBRD and IFC, have a very close relationship, give tons and tons of money on very concessional terms. There is a strong leverage position. When there is trouble between our investor, our guarantee holder, and the government, we leverage those resources. We try to come up with a solution, put the business back on the rails, and that is often what both parties are interested in, not just in packing up, leaving, and getting compensated. No, they want to continue the business as close to the original terms as possible and get the problem resolved. We come in as a third party, not totally disinterested, because we like to avoid paying claims like any insurance company. The last one, and I'll stop there, is we go back to the sovereign risk. It's plain old, if the government owes you money and they don't, we can insure that too. We have a very long title for it, non-honoring of sovereign financial obligations, but it's plain old sovereign risk. That's it.
Thank you, Frank. No, that's very useful. And the one thing that I didn't point out at the very beginning is that Frank has been an officer of the Global Association of Risk Professionals, who is our partner in this conference for the first time, I think. And it's a relationship that we think, and I think you can already tell just from the commonality of what Frank was talking about with what a lot of us worry about on the risk side and geopolitics and just in business in general and the world in general. The names of countries were flying through my mind, as you mentioned, and they all seem to be Venezuela, but that's a different issue. And also, it would be nice if I could read all the biographies, but they are on the website for the conference, and I recommend them to you. They're very nice biographies because we all wrote them ourselves and sent them to Dave Williams. So next we're going to hear from Guy Caruso, a very active member of this organization for years and years, and a very good friend of mine for longer than either of us want to remember.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back at the USAEE annual meeting, and thanks to all the leaders within the organization and the Williams family who manage these conferences so professionally. David, Frank, and I were talking yesterday afternoon about the geopolitical risk in the world of energy, especially, and probably never been higher as we sit here fall of 2015. You know, everywhere you look, obviously the headlines, Syria, Libya, Iran, and what's going to happen, Iraq and ISIS. So why aren't prices higher? You know, that was a central question of the Oil and Money conference that Dave and I were at a couple of weeks ago. And I think the geopolitics have been affected by what a lot of us in this room have been either analyzing or directly involved with, and that's the revolution that's occurred in certainly the United States, but you could even expand it to North America. And that is that the resurgence of especially light tight liquids as well as natural gas, shale gas, have really changed the geopolitics. And that's part of the reason why market perceptions are, we don't really have to worry because US oil is now going to fill in where there are gaps. And indeed, in the last 5 years, we've added about 4.5 million barrels a day of liquid supplies at a time when the geopolitical risks that Frank talked about in places like Syria, Yemen, certainly the Iranian sanctions, Libya, go on and on, Sudan, those disrupted supplies have been more than made up for by that 4.5 million barrels a day. But it certainly doesn't mean that we can be complacent, and certainly in a low price environment, almost certainly we're going to see US production down. It's done other things as well. I think it's emboldened the US foreign policy, especially with respect to willingness to take a tougher stand in the P5+1 negotiations. A lot of people think it could have been tougher, but nevertheless, the Obama administration would have never taken the stance it did with Iran if we had not had this resurgence. That's a clear change in the geopolitics of dealing with Iran and more generally with the global energy. The other one is relationship with Saudi Arabia, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail. Clearly has, I think, given US some further, I wouldn't call it leverage. I think it's changed the relationship, but it's in some ways strained the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudis are concerned about the US not being that proactive in the Gulf, especially in Saudi Arabia, now that we're increasingly self-sufficient. They don't like the policy decisions that were made about the Asia, pivot toward Asia. They're asking, does that mean you're pivoting away from us? When you pivot, you know, it means you're moving in a different direction. So the Saudis have been a bit concerned about the relationship, and I'll talk some more about that. I think the other thing that the success and the technological change that many of you in the audience know so much about is the investment cycle has been shortened for shale, not only shale gas, but for light tight oil. And that means the response time is shorter to events. We've seen it ramping up and ramping down with the recent price changes much more quickly than if it had been all conventional oil. So I think that's another part where technology and geopolitical risk intersect. Technology has changed the picture a bit. Let me move to Saudi Arabia and a little bit about the U.S.-Saudi relations. There's concern certainly in U.S. and other governments about new leadership in Saudi Arabia with the ascendancy of King Salman, not only about his health, but you know, some of the appointments he has made, in particular his young son, Mohammed bin Salman, who is now occupying a very central role within the government, Minister of Defense, head of a couple of very important policy committees. And there's certainly believed to be dissension within the Saudi government over that role of such a young, untested individual. And I do think that there is, we need to watch that space. Certainly his decisions, or that he has contributed to, in the proactive role with the bombing of Yemen and the coalition the Saudis lead, certainly questionable. And then there's a question of what's next within the Saudi government. The U.S. certainly has made it known that we continue to be extremely interested in playing an important role with the bilateral relationship. That this pivot toward Asia really doesn't imply pivoting away from Saudis. But there's concern about the Iranian agreement among the Saudi leaders, what happens now with Iran and its strong influence in Iraq, in Syria, in the role in Yemen. I think there are reasons for concern. And the U.S. political system is actually working against, in my view, against the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And by that I mean both parties are moving away from the center. And maybe it's just primary politics, but I do think the polls indicate that Republicans moving right and Democrats left. And the Saudis' support really has come from centrist or moderate, both Democrats and Republicans, and that is being lost. And so I think there's reason for the Saudis to be concerned about losing political support in the United States, not only the Congress, but the executive branch. But before I make it sound too negative about Saudis, I think there have been some positive things about King Salman's appointments. A lot of them, in our view, are based on merit, not just because you're born in the right family or the right nephew. So that's a positive thing. I think that some of the appointments are quite good. The other is, despite disagreements over Iran, Syria, and Palestinian-Israeli relations between the U.S. and Saudi, we still have pretty close and I think aligned positions on energy and dealing with emergency preparedness and intelligence sharing. I think that's still working. So those are the good things. Of course, it leaves you with questions about what comes after King Salman, who's rumored to have some health issues himself. So I think the big one for the Saudis in the near term is what happens after the P5+1 agreement with Iran is implemented, and what role does the U.S. see with U.S., Iran, and Saudi triangular relationship in the Gulf. Saudis are concerned about Iran's influence, as I mentioned, in Iraq, but also in Syria and in Yemen. So I think that's a considerable uncertainty with respect to where Iran in the U.S. Relationship is headed. And again, the role of Russia with Iran as Putin seeks to exploit any any weakness, and certainly there is a concern there between the U.S.-Iran-Saudi relationship. Iraq, I'd say, is probably the most challenged geopolitical issue in the Gulf right now because of ISIS and the seemingly unpenetrable ability to unify the country between the Kurds, Shias, and Sunnis. I don't know. Abadi is much better at it than Maliki was, but I don't see any near-term unification of that country, and there's now talk once again of the splitting up, and particularly with the ISIS success in the Sunni regions and difficulty of retaking some of that territory. So I think that's Iraq is. I'd have to leave Iraq in the pessimistic category for me, and that has to do not only politically but economically, and the difficulty they're having in actually moving forward in the development of the vast resources that we know have existed there, but they just aren't moving ahead. I think when Saddam was overthrown, there was a lot of optimism about where Iraq's production would be by 2015. A lot of people talk about 6 million barrels a day. Well, there's still 3.5, I don't know what Dave will know the exact number, but it's a long way from 6. So, it's be interesting to see how this sorts out with the Russians now taking a more active role in Syria, and thought that maybe they could also be involved in fighting ISIS in Iraq. I don't think the Iraqis will invite the Russians in, but there's some discussion about that because Putin certainly is trying to recover or to deflect the criticism over Crimea and Ukraine. His move into Syria clearly, I think, surprised some people, and it distracted some of his criticism away from Ukraine. Certainly the Russian economy is weak and weakening under low oil prices and sanctions. Russia's managed to deal with the sanctions in the short term by using some of their sovereign wealth fund and making most of their investments in ruble-based expenditures. That's mitigated a bit the sanctions and the inability to get hard currency capital expenditures. But it's eventually will hurt, and we should see expect to see Russian production declining in 2016, although it did not in 2015. I think the Russian move into Syria is a combination of, once again, Putin taking, distracting the criticism and for domestic political reasons, and also because the Chechnyan terror rebels, I guess you call them, are a big part of ISIS, and Caesar would rather fight him in Syria and Iraq than he would in Russia. It's done another thing, and that is with respect to the prospects of U.S. LNG coming into Europe, with prospects of an oversupplied LNG market in the next 3 to 5 years, certainly threatens Russia's dominance in the gas market of the EU. It's not going to take a big share of that market, but it's hurting, and the increased Norwegian supplies, increased LNG from elsewhere like Australia and Qatar means that we're probably looking at an oversupplied gas market. So at a minimum, it means Russian revenues from gas sales will be lessened over the next 3 to 5 years because prices will weaken. And volumes probably will decline as well. So that the main point for geopolitics here is I think it pushes Russia towards China, towards Eastern customers for both its natural gas and oil. And I think that's going to continue because that's where the growth in the market is. Russia and China on energy are, I think, reluctant partners, but I don't see either one sees that they have much choice going in either away from that increased dependence on each other. And there are a lot of other smaller geopolitical issues that I could go into with respect to Venezuela, Libya, and Nigeria, but I think in the interest of time that they want to leave a lot of time for interaction and with you all and among others. But the last overarching geopolitical issue, which I think is we heard some about already in this conference, is the climate change COP21 meetings coming up. I think that has the potential for increasing the, hopefully it's going to be a success and we're going to move from Paris on to more successful things. But I think it'll be difficult, as Professor Gardner mentioned yesterday, to actually achieve something that's really legally binding and enforceable. But if it moves in the right direction, I think that is what the Obama administration is pushing for, and what the other members of the leadership of COP21, certainly the French leadership is hoping for. This is the jumping off point to move on, not and that we can achieve success. But clearly a major geopolitical issue, particularly with the emerging economies and how to spend that $100 billion fund that is part of the agreement among the developed countries. I think that'll be a real challenge. And probably among the geopolitical issues in the longer term, I think that's certainly got to be very close to the top of the list. So with those few
Thank you,
things,
Dave.
Dave.
As you can tell, that I'm always just delighted to have Guy on panel with me for the sake of the audience. However, as usual, he's taken about 10 of the 11 things that I wanted to say. And we had a meeting a few years back at Oil and Money where I was substituting, actually for Adam Szyminski, that had to go back home to figure out who went home and who stayed when they were, the government stopped. And he talked before me and gave my talk. And luckily I was the middle speaker, so Sadat Husseini was the guy after me, so I gave his talk and left him alone. But as a banker, which I was through the last part of the 70s and all of the 80s into the early 90s at a company called Brown Brothers Harriman, I was their energy economist, proudly putting energy economist on my business card, supposedly the first one on Wall Street to do that. But the perspective there was, it was all about the price of oil, its effect on economies, its effect on the currency values and things like that. Those were my two primary constituents within the organization, were the chief economist's office and the currency traders. And then just the background for portfolio management purposes about where you wanted to put your money. And typically this was, the early 80s was a time right after the Iranian Revolution and during the Iran-Iraq War, which were two of the big issues. And the one thing, the 11th country name that didn't show up was a big part of a lot of the discussions back in those days, and it was Israel. And how many times do we talk about the Middle East and we don't hear the word Israel? He's still sitting there watching this nuclear agreement very carefully, Netanyahu is. And I see that as a risk. Also, guys ordering, I would have put Russia right on top of the list in terms of the most provocative country in the world with regard to geopolitics, ahead of Iran in a lot of ways, and where I'm particularly fearful. So what else is there in this whole mix that we're dealing with now that is different from the world that I worked in at Brown Brothers Harriman? Well, the point that Guy made about basically the velocity of the market And it isn't just about the US shale turning on and off, it's about the way that all of the financial markets are now working, the whole flash boys phenomena. That things just happen and translate through the market so much faster than before. The distribution of the news is so broad. The effect of social media on the geopolitical event. A lot of the Arab Spring was enabled by social media as much as any of the background circumstances that people were dealing with. So we need to keep that in mind as we send our Twitter feeds from this conference to all of the energy economics community. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. I'm not sure how much more I want to say. I see some people that I think want to say a few things in the audience about these topics. So why don't we go to Q&A? Dave Williams has a microphone in the back. Okay, right on the aisle here, part way up. Can you go faster? He's only 88.
Good morning. My name is Ed Coe, and I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you very much for your thoughts on geopolitics. You hear a lot politically about energy security, and U.S. energy security specifically. I was just wondering what the panelists' insights are regarding the possibility, and I'm not looking for a specific number, although if you have one, that would be great, about the likelihood of supply disruption and price spikes. Thank you.
Well, it's a timely question because DOE, as part of its quadrennial energy review, has recommended that there be a study on what's the appropriate size of the SPR given the political risk and the probability of a disruption. And they're meeting, that study group is meeting today and tomorrow in Washington. And I think the prospects of a disruption are high, but the key is what's the volume and what's the duration. That's always been, the formula when we did these studies before on SPR. And I think my assessment is probably higher probability of a disruption, and we've seen Libya, self-imposed one with sanctions on Iran, and in lesser extent Syria, Yemen. So I think prospects other than Saudi are pretty low for a large disruption that lasts a long time. So my own guess is that where the study will come out is at 700 million barrels in the SPR. That's more than enough to handle any potential disruption that would last long enough where you really need to use that. So, yeah, I think on the scale, if there is such a thing, and the Chamber of Commerce has actually quantified this in the Institute for 21st Century, and what that has shown is that the Energy Security Index, as they measure it, they're using 21 different measures, has never been higher. So our security now is better than it's been at any time since probably the oil embargo of '73. And that's obviously because of our increasing self-sufficiency.
Globally, it's disruption, shortage, spike. And those first two are, as Guy points out, a function of where the world oil market is right now. And the way that I count it, I do a monthly oil balances thing called Oil Market Intelligence, that we're running a surplus on the daily flows of almost 3 million barrels a day. So there's plenty there. We've been running surpluses for over a year. And that's put hundreds of millions of barrels into storage that, again, are part of it. These aren't the SPRs. These are the commercial storage. We've also had an upward sloping forward price curve for almost all of that period, which means that you get paid to store oil or to slow steam it or to leave it sort of hanging around the market. That's all available to take care of this going from disruption to shortage phase. And every month, one of the EIG publications called Energy Compass has a barometer of the geopolitical premium, which I philosophically find a little difficult. I think it really is the way we do it, a net concept. So you measure the surplus against the disruption, and we typically come up with a fairly small number, $1 or $2 of it. And there are times in the past when that number could be $15 or $20 of the price, back when you were up at 100. Had something to do with either a current set of disruptions, which it was for 2013 when Libya went out, where Sudan was out, various other things. And EIA does a nice job of looking at places where there are disruptions going on. And that, and it was $100 oil, so on a percentage basis, maybe it's not all that different. But you always have to measure it against the size of or the condition of the current market and this velocity thing that I mentioned before.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, I forgot, was that China is also now has its own SPR, and that helps with this.
Right, and India is starting to build one as well. And from the standpoint of the US SPR, remember that that's part of a treaty from 1974 with the IAEA, where there is an obligation against your import dependency. And of course that has gone down and down and down progressively as the light tight oil domestically has replaced the Nigerian and Angolan and North Sea and the various other light imports that used to come into the US. So there's a bunch of money there, and last time I checked, I think there still was a deficit in Washington, wasn't there? So maybe there's better uses for the money. Dave, how about Amy Jaffe? Oh, you got one back there, and then Amy, you're next. Oh, Helen Thomas is alive. Go ahead.
Can't hear. Wait a minute.
Yeah. Are you guys staying on the same topic? If not, I'd like to weigh in on this SBR question. Thanks, Gabe, and thanks to the person in the back. I thought I'd just comment in and ask you guys a question. So I'm not disagreeing with anything you've said for this year, but I would disagree with your sort of characterization of it because it makes it sound like it's a permanent condition. And people are talking about actually selling, well, people voted to sell the SPR yesterday or the day before. So let me paint actually a very different picture than the picture you painted, right? So we're in an economic slump, and the Chinese are in an economic slump, but we're not in an economic slump, but everybody else is in an economic slump. But one has to figure, the business cycle is cyclical, and sometime hopefully in the next 3 to 5 years, the global economy would start growing again, right? And in addition to that, the majors have taken the strategic position that the market's not rewarding them for spending their capital. And so everybody's making fiscal flexibility, right? They're buying back their own stock, no one's exploring, they've canceled or delayed all the deep water Africa, some of the deep water Africa projects. You've got, LNG's on hold forever. So you have a lot of postponements.
Arctic.
Right, Arctic. And that means that we're still working off the peak of CapEx spent over the last 5 years, but eventually that's going to kick in some real way, again in the 3 to 5 year horizon probably, right? On top of the fact that all the oil sands, unless you're already operating, is on hold, right? So we got the shale, right? I'm sure it's got some flexibility to go up if prices were to go up again. So I'm not saying that that's not like a surge production, but on top of that, you've got all the things that Guy mentioned. But what Guy didn't mention, because the media keeps following Donald Trump and saying the opposite of what's happened, is that every oil field that ISIS has captured, quote unquote, they've either destroyed it because they can't manage the pressure of the field, or they've blown it up because somebody else was going to take it away from them. And so you have this systematic, right now it's very small oil fields, but you have the systematic destruction of very small oil fields in Yemen and Syria, and to some extent, some small fields in Western Iraq. And in addition to that, my understanding from talking to people who operate in Libya, because the situation in Libya is so unstable, people having to turn their production on and off, the Libyan fields are damaged, or many of the Libyan fields are damaged. So if we do not have an effective response, Russia is escalating this war against ISIS. ISIS is escalating its spread of itself to different places. They've specifically said they're targeting the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Again, in the 3 to 5 year time frame, it seems possible that A, we will have quote unquote worked off the surplus when it comes to productive capacity because of all these wars. There's this possibility of a giant escalation in all these wars. And then in addition to that, you have to ask yourself if some of these wars could spread to infrastructure in major producing countries. And then if it doesn't and everything stays the way it is, then you have to worry about Russia imploding because then the price of oil would stay very low. And as Guy mentioned, they have severe economic problems. And we know the last time that happened in Russia, their production went down by 50%. So my point to you is, when you look out on the horizon, it seems quite unwise to sell the SPR, even though we might not need it for ourselves because maybe our production would be robust.